Okay, so we delve into our conversation for today. South Africa's energy regulator allowed state-owned Eskom to raise electricity tariffs by 12.7%, according to reports, well below the amount requested by the debt-laden utility that is trying to turn around its finances. The adjustment is a fraction of the 36% increase that Eskom asked for from the National Energy Regulator of South Africa. Eskom, the recipients of 250 billion rand, talking about $13.5 billion government bailout, asked the regulator to raise tariffs by more than a third to avoid having to ask for more state funding. But NERSA refused, settling for 12.7% instead. I have on the show Phelisa Nkomo, who's an economist, and we'll be talking about this together. Thank you so much, Phelisa, for joining us on the show.
To listeners.
Okay, so Phelisa, be it 36% or 12.7%, is the hike in tariff justified when load shedding has only recently stabilized?
Well, I mean, one of the key things that Eskom, like any other utility, is to always submit their application for tariffs, because we know that tariff is actually the source of revenue for Eskom, for it to be able to fulfill its responsibility. So in essence, it's true that if you are looking for what they'd ask, which is 36% versus the 12%, I mean, the difference is really just above 15%. And obviously, one of the key things that NERSA undertakes is a very deep, detailed financial model. And so there's a scientific assessment of what they do, so of the decisions that they take. So they're not really informed by some thumb-sucking or the use of common sense. So amongst the other things they do is that they look at electricity demand projections. I mean, they look at as well as how the company is doing, but also they look at other variables that are quite important in consideration. So the point I'm trying to make is that, and obviously as a citizen, I'm really relieved with the 12% as a citizen, but I do think that Eskom would then have to really think about how to raise the shortfall of the of just so that is above 15% that have not been granted by NERSA.
But then how do you expect, Eskom to raise that shortfall, because it is hugely in debt? It's trying to stay away from government interventions, and what it's asking for is a raise. So if it cannot get 36%, and you're saying that it should be able to raise the amount it needs to bridge its budget and, of course, pay its own debt, how do you think it will be able to do that?
Well, I mean, I think this decision triggers several things, and you're correct that I'll come back to your question. It triggers, firstly, there's been, I mean, really a public concern about the wage bill of Eskom. That's the first thing. There's been a public concern about the human capital composition of the company. But obviously, the key issue, though, is that the management of Eskom and the board of Eskom now needs to go back into the drawing board and really think about what's a new business model they might need to explore. Now, the point you're making is that how is Eskom going to have to manage the debt that it currently has? Now, remember that state-owned enterprises' debts across the world is always going to be a contingent liability of national treasuries, which is national governments naturally kind of like inherit that type of debt. And it comes with the notion of owning state-owned enterprises. So in essence, South Africa is actually not unique. So what government has done, I think the point to make is that they have been given 250 billion bailout, right? But there are certain conditions that they would put on the table to address those bailouts. And in fact, amongst the key things we demanded, we would ask as economists, is that is it possible for Treasury to actually publish some of the conditions they've put in there? That's the first thing. And then the second issue is that we learned that there was a mechanism that was being explored to ensure that the debt is actually set aside, because this is also happening on the back of Eskom unbundling, where, for instance, there's going to be a separation of transmission as well as generation and the administration of Eskom. So you know that Eskom has been a vertically integrated company. So there's been a lot of internal, what you call, cross-subsidization. And what the unbundling is going to then lead to is to really look at and say which business that is not doing well, which business that is actually demanding a lot more cross-subsidization. On the back of that, by the way, is also the debt of municipalities, right? And Eskom has really been, going into court, has been really been using courts to force municipalities to actually owe, to pay some of their debts. And it's really been a struggle. So the point I'm trying to make is that I think for me, everything else now is at the door of Eskom management and the board. But one of the key things, though, just to wrap up this issue, is that Eskom has really received a lifeline from public resources from the longest time. And I think it's high time for them to really start thinking through on what is the best, because I think everything else lies in the business model. Because remember, the business model of Eskom, we've inherited it from during the apartheid system, and now it needs to change. It needs to change to look at to fulfill or to be responsive to the current circumstances. One of those circumstances is the fact that coal has become expensive. The second one is that our balance sheet is not strong enough to actually subsidize Eskom, but also, thirdly, is that there's a symbiotic relationship between performance of the economy, which is GDP output, versus how actually there's a demand for electricity in the economy.
Okay, so Phelisa, you talked about demand for electricity, you've talked about the operationalization of the utility, and you've talked about debt owed by municipalities. You've also talked about situations around what the government has done so far to help Eskom stay in operation. But then some people have actually talked about mismanagement, financial mismanagement in the utility as one of the factors whereby we've seen Eskom struggle financially. Would you also consider that as a factor amidst probably external economic factors or probably some other reasons that we've seen play out in the country?
I think there are a combination of factors. In fact, both points you're making are absolutely correct, right? So the first one, it's true that we've heard the history of mismanagement. Eskom, for instance, corruption, abuse of resources, but also just the fact that Eskom was not getting value for money. That has been the concern for everyone else. I think that's the first thing. I think the second issue has been that, of course, the state of the economy. In fact, we've had several industries closing down. I mean, right now, we have almost just above 3,000 firms that are going to be closing down. Part of it has to do with the state of the economy, but also in the fact that our GDP output has become a lot more lower. And actually, when you think about it, is that Eskom is really the nerve center. It's the engine that drives growth, because for every entrepreneur, for every investor, amongst the key things they look for is security of supply in terms of energy and security of supply so that they're able to get their goods manufactured and actually getting into the consumers. So it's really a combination of factors. And I think, also the fact that actually we've seen that the ownership of state-owned enterprises has really evolved over time. And amongst the key things that the state needs to actually explore part of those different mechanisms of ownership and the business model fundamentally.
So would that mean that you are pushing for probably a privatization of Eskom to get it up and running?
Look, I'm a economic inclusion person. I work on equity issues. So in essence, for me, access to energy for South Africans is very important. So therefore, I may not really be panting for a privatization per se, but the biggest issue for me is that, firstly, the unbundling process needs to identify areas of poor performance within the business, because as I was saying that, because Eskom has been a vertically integrated company, so in essence, vertically integrated companies tend to cross-subsidize. So we need to be able to actually look at it and say, from the generation component, its generation, its transmission, its admin, we look at which other parts. And then on the back of that, you then begin and say, how do you then trigger what you call energy policy diversity? Because energy policy diversity, amongst the key things it promotes, is that we can't be relying only on coal. So firstly, there's a possibility that you could start triggering or introducing renewable energy specifically for households. So where you say all the households must actually start relying installing solar, and therefore when they install solar, they are off the grid. When they're off the grid, it means that then what Eskom does is actually supporting the economy, meaning the industry in this context. And in fact, by the way, data shows that there's very much little that Eskom, household use, most of the time is actually used by the demand for energy is actually coming from the energy. So there are several things that this moment we're in, and we do think that NERSA's decision is pushing Eskom for a lot more strategic thinking, but also as well the expansion of renewable assets, including, by the way, the possibility of actually increasing investment on renewable infrastructure.
All right, so Phelisa, if we continue to look at the possibility of diversifying energy sources, we look at renewable assets that the country has to actually power businesses and homes, but then we still have consumers not paying for services being provided to them. We are still probably going to be at the same spot, because you talked about debts being owed by municipalities, and people are saying that why is it that the government didn't come up with policies to enforce payments for the provision of electricity to those who have been, given over time. And if we have all these on our table in terms of renewable energies and all that, but then people are not meeting up with payments, then Eskom will still be in the position of indebtedness.
Yes and no, right? So the first issue is that, and I think this is a historic issue, that both Eskom and government has not been able to resolve. During the apartheid system, there was an open call for the political parties who were then operating in the ground that people should stop paying services, right? And part of it was about undermining and also delegitimizing the white government that was actually oppressive then. We've not been able to deal with the culture of non-payment, right? So the user pay principle has really not been fully entrenched. Of course, that has also been exacerbated by the fact that our economy has not really grown in a way that it creates jobs, but also people run businesses, can run businesses, run robust businesses and good income. But also the other issue as well is the fact that because municipalities actually are classified as delinquent and not paying, what is actually happening is that you've had a lot more people who are falling into what we call indigent data, meaning in this context, you find families of 6 to 7 with absolutely no one working in those households. So in essence, there are a confluence of issues and variables that truly influence where Eskom is and the fact that there's been an increased non-payment. And I think that Eskom is not going to be able to deal with non-payment issues alone without the support of government. And I suspect part of the reason why government is actually intervening through the bailouts is to actually ease the pressure. But also the bigger issue is to really make it sure that citizens do pay. But citizens, then the precondition for the citizens to be able to pay is that they must be working. And if the economy is not creating jobs, then that's always going to be the challenge. So we're really caught it's a double-edged sword, or we're caught in a rock and a hard place. And therefore, hence, then Eskom leadership is actually now compelled to really think through on the outcome of NERSA decision. And of course, as a citizen of South Africa, and I suppose all of us are saying thank you to the 12%, because we've really been feeling the austerity measures, the monetary policy austerity measures, and the increased cost of electricity. And for us, it's actually quite a relief. And if you think about it, by the way, we've just had actually 2 consecutive interest rate decline in the two and the third quarter of the year, and now this NERSA decision, it's really intended to actually particularly activate what we call supply side of the economy, because then businesses now are going to start paying a lot less in terms of the electricity usage, particularly those who are intensive users of the electricity.
And we also understand that, Eskom received about 250 billion rand. That's about $13.5 billion from government in a bailout. There's a possibility the government might also be releasing another 54 billion rand to Eskom to buffer its financial portfolio. But then I'd like to find out from you, if we're seeing government bailouts, we're seeing investments in renewable energy, does the Treasury have that financial capacity to carry that burden on Eskom's behalf? Because it doesn't look as though either foreign or domestic investors will be willing to put their stake on Eskom.
I mean, absolutely, you're correct. National Treasury has no capacity to really do this bailout. In fact, when you actually track state-owned enterprises in South Africa, have received massive bailouts. And I think part of the issue we've not been able to really interrogate as citizens is the fact that, firstly, the debt of SOEs is the contingent liability of the state, meaning that it becomes a public debt. Now, it means that ordinary citizens are actually paying for both the debt and as well as bailout. Now, the system that we introduced in state-owned enterprises, which we called corporatization, one of the key things, and that corporatization meant that the state-owned enterprises will then have its board, will actually be able to run itself independently, etc. So what is actually going to happen? What is that meant to do is that SOEs are just meant to be run independently. But in fact, what we're seeing as the outcome of that corporatization has been the fact that actually there's been not only poor performance, but there's been poor management issues. So in essence, if government is planning to deploy additional 250 billion, truly it has to really attach a lot more stricter conditions. Now, the point I made earlier was that we were promised that the 250 billion that only branch that was extended to Eskom, that the conditions will be published. We've not seen the conditions, and we actually need to start scrutinizing the conditions of this other 254 billion that is likely to be extended to Eskom.
Well, it's quite interesting that according to NERSA, there's been a 3-year approval for these hikes, even as we understand 12.7% for the year, March 2026, 5.36% for 2027, 6.19% for 2028, which means that we'll continue to see a hike in tariff prices, and that is going to affect a lot of businesses. One of the things that you mentioned, and including households. We don't know, maybe there could be some sort of resistance on the part of the consumers as regards this, but what is important is that power is supplied and Eskom continues to perform optimally, if possible. Thank you so much, Phelisa, for sharing your thoughts with us on the show. We appreciate your contribution.